Welcome to the conversation that was due to happen in Stanford's workshop 2 weeks ago, but it's been cancelled for reasons that I won't explain. I am here, my name's Nick Hunt, I'm here with Lucy Jones, who is the author of Losing Eden, Why Our Minds Needle, and Alice Vincent, author of Rootbound, Rewilding a Life. And we have about 40 minutes to talk about these two books, which are both absolutely brilliant. I'm going to start with Lucy's book and just give a little introduction to it. Losing Eden is it's a personal journey and kind of part memoir about a certain period of your life, Lucy, as well as being a deeply researched exploration into the science and the philosophy, but there's a lot of science in it of why nature is good for us. So when we go into greenery, when we find ourselves under trees, when we feel solace or inspiration or exhilaration or just sheer relief at being in nature, your book explains what's actually going on psychologically and physiologically. I don't want to talk too much about coronavirus, but there are some very interesting things we can talk about in the context of these times with this book. Obviously, we're all stuck inside, and your book is about why we need to be outside. Alice, Rootbound charts a transition from the end of a long-term relationship to the start of another relationship. You describe a life that's very deeply embedded in London. London's a big part of this book, embedded in the festival circuit and the world of media and parties and this quite kind of trendy London lifestyle. But at the same time, you have a very deep relationship with plants, and particularly indoor plants, which again has lots of interesting links and connotations with this lockdown that we're currently experiencing. We'll inevitably talk about these in the context of this very strange cultural moment that we find ourselves in. But first of all, I just thought maybe a good place to start is these two books are obviously very different, but they speak to each other. They have similar kind of trajectories. It feels like your lives have been on similar paths. And these relationships between the natural world and the city, and the tame and the wild come into play so much in both these books. There's a kind of mycorrhizal entanglement going on where your books are communicating on some kind of deep level. So I thought maybe just to start off, I'd just ask, were you aware of each other's work while you were writing these books? Did you know each other? Maybe start with Lucy.
Sure, thank you. That was a beautiful and very thoughtful introduction. Weirdly, me and Alice worked at the same newspaper, but not at the same time. So I used to work at the Telegraph on the comment and news desk, and Alice has recently left the Telegraph. I don't think we overlapped, did we, Alice? But we certainly knew of each other, and I think you commissioned me a couple of times, didn't you? And I have kind of observed and admired Alice's work. And actually, I bought her book, her first book, How to Grow Stuff, a few years ago when I started getting into growing stuff myself. So I feel like Alice has definitely inspired and influenced me over the last few years, for sure.
I wanted, maybe it's too early to ask this, but what did you learn from each other's books? Because they're kind of working on different levels with the indoor and the outdoor, but you're both obviously fascinated by living things, by nature, by plants.
Yeah, I would say it was very much like reading. I found like Lucy's book really explained a lot of the the kind of feelings that I was expressing in Rootbound, which does deal with like outdoors as much as like the houseplant phenomenon and the millennial obsession with that, but also very much like my distinct urge to be outside. And I felt that losing Eden picked up those feelings and gave me reason for them, which was just fascinating. And I found myself connecting and just feeling like, oh, that's why that happens, because as the book proposes, like, we know it makes us feel good to be outside, but it's the why that has remained unraveled until this book came along, for me at least. So it felt like somebody saying, yes, you're right, and this is why. I found it fascinating.
For me, I think that Alice has a really kind of strong and keen eye, and I feel like she deepened and enriched my my way of seeing plants and nature through her prose, which is just very open and generous and beautiful, but also the botanical history. After I read it, I felt I just knew so much more about the rest of nature. And also, kind of similar to what Alice said, she described feelings and kind of their emotional, psychological relationship with nature and plants with words that I couldn't have found myself. You know, she put kind of words to feelings that I'd had.
The feeling I had, there's a bit in your book, Lucy, you described so one of the most amazing facts in the book is this idea that the brain literally grows bigger when it's in a complex natural environment, from the neuronal connections and new pathways being forged and reforged. And that's how I felt with both your books, actually. My brain expanded in different ways, both an appreciation both of the kind of fascinating science and the beauty, as you say, through the prose. It was quite hard. I was trying to think of kind of my favorite thing that I learned from your book, Lucy, about the physical and mental benefits we get from nature. And it's quite hard because there's so many wonderful examples. One of the bits of research that really stood out for me, I've just started, I've always been someone that's admired people who grow things, but I've never done it, which is pure laziness and luxury. And now it feels like a very good time to start planting things. So I've just been doing that. And you describe how when you touch soil and when you garden, when you work in the soil, there's literally microbial life forms that enter your skin. Am I right? And actually enter your body.
I think it's mostly through kind of the airways, actually. So through kind of them being in the atmosphere and on the soil and us inhaling them that way.
It's just such an amazing idea. And so there is forest bathing that they prescribe in Japan, which is similar, right? It's not just in your head, it's actually things entering your body that change you. I've never kind of realized so immediately what these benefits are. And I thought, Alice, you're obviously a very keen and good green-fingered gardener. And if these things are actually entering our body and changing us when we garden, it's very clear that plants aren't just decoration, right? They are actually doing something to us and for us.
Yeah. Sorry, Lucy.
No, you go, Alice.
I think the interesting thing that's happened in gardening relatively recently, I mean, a part of the book does explore the political edge and like political rhythm of gardening that has always been an undercurrent and managed through some masterful PR on horticulture's front to get buried and hidden over the years and dressed up as something pretty and prissy and luxurious somehow. But what I would say the interesting thing that's happened in recent years with gardening is that we're starting to see our gardens as not just spaces for our own leisure, but as ones that are crucial for the wider ecological and wildlife existences that we exist alongside. And I think that, you know, in my brain connects with, if it feels good for for nature generally, it's also good for us. And I think that separation of seeing gardens as just something that looks pretty, as something that feels good, and something that actively motivates us to keep doing is crucial. And people who garden have always gardened know this, but it seems like a bit of a secret until you start digging or tending or doing gardening, basically. Lucy, I interrupted you.
I think that the point about kind of the plants and the soil and gardening kind of entering us almost kind of in a relationship, physically, mentally, psychologically, also speaks to kind of our disconnection from the rest of nature, and the idea that our bodies and our skins are kind of adamantine shields, and that we're not intimately interconnected, with the microbes among us, with the soil, with the forests, with the phytoncides, which are the chemical compounds that trees emit, which research shows actually has a positive physiological effect on us. That's research done by Dr. King Lee in the forest bathing field in Japan. And I think that kind of goes to the root of our dysfunctional relationship with the land and the earth, of thinking that we are separate and shielded, whereas we are interwoven, and without a relationship with the rest of nature, we are psychologically and spiritually and mentally impoverished because of it.
And it seems, it's extraordinary that that's even a revelation, isn't it? That we are intimately entangled with the world in which we live and that has formed us, and a sign of how disconnected we've become. We even need to say that.
Yeah, Wendell Berry has a good quote. I think I put it in Losing Eden, that we kind of unconsciously are involved in the destruction of the natural world because we don't really see those processes, by which, our consumerism or the things that we do are actually harming the planet. So there's no way of really knowing or seeing that. So it's a kind of unconscious planetary suicide.
Mm-hmm. There's a real kind of generational aspect to both your books. You're talking about this kind of planetary suicide, an awareness that you're writing at a time in which certain aspects of the web of life are unraveling, and this concept of ecocide is becoming more and more apparent. And there's obviously been there's been a lot of books written about how nature's good for us, but I've really felt the shadow in both your books of we're living in a time of loss and of impoverishment. That comes across very clearly. I just wonder if you wanted to say anything about that, about what it's like to write about nature in the times we're in now.
It's actually really surprising that you pick up on that, because one of the things that I was so conscious of in the wake of the book being published is that when it came out, it was a kind of about 6 months to a year after Extinction Rebellion, and Greta Thunberg really made mainstream attention. And as a result, I'd kind of handed in my manuscript, and I thought very much, I was like, wow, this is going to seem quite almost willfully ignorant of that movement because it doesn't directly address it. And so therefore it's interesting that you picked it up. I think the sense that I was maybe you found was that I felt I was part of a generation, which we're all part of, which is that even though I was raised in the countryside and with grandparents who gardened, and when in a large garden, I was just not, it was not something that was fed to me. It wasn't something that was considered that important. And Lucy delves into this far more, but I think part of the reason that our generation are reaching out to nature and are wanting to garden, are collecting houseplants and are going to ground is because we've had it ripped from us. It's not been part of our dialogue. Instead, we learn how to get onto the internet and how to use smartphones and how to have everything as quickly as possible. And when I started gardening, it was a really weird and frumpy thing to do. Like, it was not a cool thing. And so maybe that's part of that dialogue, but I find it really interesting you pick up on it, because I think if I was writing that book again now, I'd definitely address it more thoroughly.
I think it's difficult to write now about, to kind of do nature writing, as it were, without writing about kind of loss and extinction. And I think I noticed, like, so I started researching Losing Eden about 8 years ago, and I've noticed in the last few years that those concepts of ecological grief and climate anxiety and global dread and solastalgia have become much more mainstream. You can talk about ecological grief. I think most people will know what you mean, whereas maybe kind of 5-10 years ago, I'm sure obviously the Dark Mountain project that you're involved with, Nick, and people like deep ecologists have been talking about these things for many years, decades. But I think we have seen a kind of a consciousness raising about kind of the state of things. When I started to research, I wanted to go to the Svalbard seed bank, which is that kind of doomsday vault where countries across the world can put their seeds for safekeeping in case of ecocide or civilization collapse. And I also wanted to go to one of the oldest forests in Europe, which was being logged at the time. And at that point, I couldn't quite make the connection between why I was wanting to go to these quite depressing places. Obviously, now looking back on it, it's kind of obvious that not only did I want to write about the positive therapeutic benefits of contact with nature, but I just felt like I couldn't do that without addressing the flip side of how the disconnection and the destruction must be affecting our mental health individually and collectively. And I think that that's much more kind of present and central in the discourse now.
Yeah, it's really it feels like it's in the last kind of year really that these things have kind of become suddenly these exponential growth of understanding of things like you say solastalgia and nature deficit disorder. That might be a good word though, to solastalgia. Could you just explain what that means for people that might not have heard that term before, because it is being bandied around a lot in kind of nature writing circles. I don't think it's quite penetrated mainstream. It's not a household word yet, but solastalgia, what is it and how does it affect what you've been writing about?
Sure. So solastalgia is a neologism, a concept coined by the Australian philosopher, farmer Glenn Albrecht. And so it's a combination of solace and nostalgia, and it means a feeling of loss and sadness connected with the loss of place. Mm-hmm. So, for example, Australian farmers, who've lost their farms recently because of the climate emergency, will feel solastalgia about kind of a loss of or landscape or place. My grandmother, for example, may experience solastalgia about the loss of kind of butterflies and birds and those kind of elements. So that's what it describes.
And Alice, you said just a second ago it's something that's been ripped from us, right? You grew up in the countryside, and that word ripped really leapt out at me. It's a violent process that's happened. We've had this kind of access to nature stripped away.
Yeah, it's funny, and I feel like by using that word, it makes it sound like pejoratively on my upbringing, which wasn't the case. I had a very outdoorsy upbringing. If anything, I was kind of, my mother would like threaten to move to a flat with no garden if I didn't play in it more. Like I was quite an indoorsy child. I think it was more of a cultural shift. Like if you look into the 90s, everyone was bringing potpourri and fake flowers into their homes. They were paving over their back gardens. Everyone was decking everything. Like it was a whole cultural shift that we were just not really paying attention to our gardens. And more widely, I mean, there was a concert. I went to a village school with a conservation area, which we loved, and there was frog spawn in the jars on the nature table and stuff, but that was kind of the limit of it. And it's interesting, the more people I talk to of my age, and before Rootbound, I was writing about gardening. Been writing about gardening for the past 5 years, and people come to me and they're like, I think it's weird and cool, I think it's weird and nerdy, and I don't think people do it that much, but I really like growing, and how do I do it? And we don't know how to grow stuff. It's interesting that you started this conversation by saying that you didn't know how to grow in your garden, and I don't think that's anyone's fault. We're taught how to sweep our houses and make ourselves dinner, and in theory we should be able to know how to tend to our outdoor spaces the same way we tend to our indoor ones, but we're not taught that. And that's possibly a conversation for another day, but I don't think it was quite the same for our parents and the people who went before them, because our grandparents had the war effort, our parents grew up in the wake of that, and there was a whole good life movement. And maybe we're discovering something for ourselves, but it becomes a very more potent and political thing at a time when the planet is so visibly dying.
Yeah, it does. I mean, both these books are kind of, I think that's what I meant about this generational thing as well. And I remember from your book, you talked about this shift in the 90s, which, you know, now you kind of bring it to my attention. I can remember that, but I wouldn't have been conscious of it, I don't think, unless you kind of pointed that out, that there was this sort of shift towards away from this kind of messy, untidy nature. And like you say, it just wasn't cool. There's a really, one of my favorite parts in your book, Alice, is this kind of, it's almost like a dream sequence where you go from, you're at a festival, a music festival, and everyone's there on, you know, in glitter and wellies on drugs. And then you just kind of take this plunge into the Victorian phenomenon of, if I've got this right, Pteridymania?
Pteridymania, yeah.
Pteridymania, fern collecting.
Yeah.
A craze that I'd never heard of before.
Yeah.
And you describe the way that kind of these Victorian enthusiasts, particularly women, kind of stripped ferns from all over the country and decimated the fern population.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you're back in a kind of glade lit up with dance music playing in the rain. It's this kind of sort of Midsummer Night's Dream weirdness to that beautiful section. And throughout your book, you're kind of going back and forward between these two worlds. I was really fascinated by this kind of interplay between London, actually, but you know, a kind of London life, a fashionable London life, I suppose, of kind of, you know, media stuff going on, parties, events, but with this much slower, deeper process in your life at the same time of nurturing life inside your flat. I mean, both of you have kind of, you have this traffic between what seems to me like two aspects of your lives. I just wonder if you'd say anything about that, about kind of holding these two things together.
It's an interesting thing, I think, for now I've left the Telegraph. They're not quite so separated, because like Lucy, and this is an interesting other parallel between us, is that we were both music journalists for quite a long time. And I write less about music now, but it was that for a long time I felt like I would inhabit this world of music and media and parties and late nights, and then I would possibly sometimes 2 or 3 hours after I'd come home from clubbing, like fall out of bed and onto the balcony and be tending ferns as the sun rose, like, and it was almost like, and then I had a separate world of gardening, and people would have, that my gardening friends would possibly have no idea that I existed as a music journalist, and my music journalist friends would have no idea I existed as a gardener, and the two never seemed to mix. But I'm trying to smush them together. To me, it increasingly makes more sense that it's fine to do both. But Lucy made a really interesting point about this at another time, about why there are so many music journalists who end up becoming nature writers, and I'd like to hear her talk about that again.
The caught by the river phenomenon, that's like the kind of epitome of that, right? Is music journalists from the 90s who ended up writing about fishing, and then sort of the whole world of nature writing, but they bring these two worlds together. Yeah, Lucy, what were you going to say on that?
Well, I guess, I mean, solipsistically maybe, but also I think lots of people feel like this. People who love music or clubbing or dancing like escape, and, you know, that feeling of oblivion, or kind of getting out of your own head. And I think that there are parallels between listening to an incredible song, or like clubbing with your friends at a festival or whatever, and being really absorbed in a plant or the natural world, or swimming in a river. For me, those two experiences are quite kind of lysergic, and I compare them both to kind of taking LSD almost. They're kind of perception changing. One of the the neuroscience of nature connection is quite fledgling, but an interesting study suggested that spending time in green space and around trees can reduce activity in the default mode network, which is the area of the brain concerned with the sense of self. And I think that's definitely something that I go to when I go into nature. I kind of want to forget myself. I want to tune into something bigger, and get absorbed into the ecology around me, which is similar to going clubbing and dancing the night away. I think it's kind of mind altering, isn't it, and escapist.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm talking about festivals, they're quite interesting. I mean, for a lot of people, urban people, going to a festival is maybe the only time in a year when they're going to spend 3 days outside, and sleeping in tents. And there's this strange it's this fantasy of, it's Arcadia, you dress up as a fairy and get a bit muddy. And they have this kind of, I mean, it's the absolute opposite to actual wilderness, right? I mean, there's a festival called Wilderness that is totally controlled and totally tamed, but just made pretty with fairy lights in trees. But it's always felt there's like this kind of yearning in festivals for this kind of, again, this sort of Midsummer Night's Dream fantasy that you can access by paying to go to this kind of prescribed space to get out of your head in the great outdoors.
Yeah, and I guess that speaks to the kind of connection. Sorry.
No, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say that that speaks to the idea of kind of connection and communion, I think, that people find in festivals and kind of listening to music with friends, but also kind of in the natural world, when you become aware of the amount of species that we share, even our local urban patches with. There's a sense that you're never alone, and that you're always kind of alongside something. And I guess it's just similar to being at a festival, isn't it? It's communion on a level that we all want, and especially at the moment, clearly we're thirsting for.
Yeah. And communion is like, again, in your book, Lucy, you talk about the science of awe, which was something I love, that idea that there being a science of the feeling of awe, and that people who experience awe on a regular basis, whether that's religious or being in the mountains or having that that feeling of being awestruck, it seems to affect their compassion and levels of generosity, right? People seem to be kinder, more willing to help strangers, to share things. That's a very useful idea, a very hopeful idea.
It is. That research blew my mind. That was amazing. Yeah. In California, a guy called Dasha Keltner. I mean, the fact that awe can like physiologically affect us, it can kind of reduce the amount of inflammation biomarkers in the body, but also that it can have this kind of ethical impact, making people more generous and kind. It's great science.
Yeah. There was the week we were meant to have this talk at Stanford's, there was an article in The Guardian by Patrick Barkham that both of your books were mentioned in, alongside books like H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald and The Outrun by Amy Liptrot, and lots of books that I guess are loosely bracketed together in the new nature writing, whatever that is. And he talked to Richard Mabey, who's the kind of sort of the godfather of well, he wrote the book called The Nature Cure, I think 1995 or 2005. I'm going to have to switch screens very dangerously now to see, because I thought this was worth talking about. Patrick Barkham said he asked Richard Mabey if he regrets being midwife to the nature cure subgenre, and Richard Mabey emphatically replies yes. And I just wanted to talk about this in the light of your books. Richard Mabey, who kind of came up, is heavily associated with this idea of nature being a cure for human ills, said, "I'm worried that it's become mooted as a kind of panacea, green Prozac. If there's anything wrong, you just go out and look at the pretty flowers and you're going to be marvelous. That's a tall order if the natural world is in a state of crisis, with the insect apocalypse and British songbird collapsing all around us. There's also a danger that therapeutic nature becomes another way in which nature is reduced to being a service provider." I thought, just as a kind of slight devil's advocate, is there a danger in looking at the kind of understanding why nature has this effect on us? Is there a slight danger that this kind of feeds into this scientific worldview that arguably was responsible for kind of stripping away our awe of nature in the first place? Or maybe it's better to say, how do you balance that? How does that help you appreciate nature rather than just trying to kind of materialistically reduce it to its component parts as this kind of service providing entity that benefits humans? Sorry, that's a hideously phrased question.
I feel like Lucy should have maybe the mic drop on this, so I'll dip in quickly. Also because I'm being told that we have 7 minutes left. There's a ticker in the top, so we can always have another session, but so you're not caught off guard. What I would say is that, number one, that article was brilliant, and I think Lucy's book was a huge part in its existence, and I was very proud of her for that. But I think my main argument back would be like, yes, we've got to be conscious that it's not a cure-all, and I think you'd have to take someone who'd really had a very naive understanding of any of the arguments made in the genre of books that, found plants, gardened myself to better. And that is actually a phrase from my own book, that I did garden myself and I felt better. But it's not the entire thing. It never would be. And actually the amount of plant blindness, the amount of nature ignorance that people have, I don't think it's such a bad problem. If we say, oh, go outside and you'll feel better, it gets a few more people outside and more conscious of what we are living among, and they're more aware of it, then they'll be able to take better care of it. I think we're a long way off people being so reliant on nature for aid that they think it's the only solution. I'd like to have that conversation when we are nearer that point, because I think the world will be in a better place.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would totally agree with everything Alice just said. I also thought it was a brilliant article. I love that Nature Cure book by Richard Mabey. I think I read it quite a long time ago, and then I read it a couple of times while I was writing Losing Eden. I'd say I make a couple of points. It was quite important to me with Losing Eden to make the point that, because part of the narrative is a kind of recovery memoir, that psychiatry, psychotherapy, and the support of friends and family, alongside connecting with nature, were and are things that I need for my mental health. So I didn't want to kind of present it as, a cure-all, and I don't think I did. Secondly, the other thing that I found kind of inspiring was reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which I read quite a few times while I was researching and writing. And I think she really beautifully puts across this idea of reciprocity, and kind of how we can be in a mutualistic relationship with the land and the world among us. And I find that is, you know, really common among people who love nature and nature writers, and, you know, those of us who want to spend our times with the rest of nature. You know, the idea that we are kind of just taking from it doesn't seem to be borne out, certainly in my experience. And to echo what Alice says, you know, if we imbue kind of people, children, with wonder and awe and the love of the natural world, you know, that can lead to pro-environmental behaviours, which is what we kind of urgently need. I think I'm quite wary of kind of, I was talking to a brilliant psychotherapist called Mary Jane Rust, who's kind of written and worked in this area for a long time. And we talked about how sometimes you see kind of language like making the woods work for us, or, you know, how can we kind of utilize the forests, you know, for our mental health and so on. I just think we need to be careful, you know, that nature doesn't exist as a medicine for us. That's not what it should be seen as, or, you know, it needs to be intrinsically looked after and kind of allowed to thrive and flourish, you know, for itself, not just because it makes us all feel good. But at the same time, you know, I think you can't not kind of encourage people or spell out the evidence for it, because, you know, it clearly is very powerful and healing. And yeah, so I respect Richard Maybe massively, but I think that a lot of people, I certainly have been massively helped by like the Outrun and other nature cure books, and H is for Hawk. I found those books really you know, have been really comforting at times. So yeah, I'm all for them.
Well, that idea of reciprocity is very important. And I think, I mean, both of you have done it through your writing. You're kind of, you know, living evidence that you're not just taking things from nature, but you're giving back through the forms of your books. And what you were saying about children and nature is, I mean, we don't really have, maybe it's a good thing, we don't have a lot of time to get into coronavirus. I think maybe that's best avoided. But the kind of obvious question is, are we bringing up a generation of kids who are going to have a foundational memory of nature being dangerous, dirty, contagious? And your book, Lucy, obviously starts and ends with babies. Where were we? Just on a point of, are we bringing up kids to be terrified of the outside world with what's going on at the moment? I thought that might be something to touch upon. Do you want to jump in there, Lucy?
Yeah, sure. I think, I mean, in a way, we've been bringing up children to be afraid of the natural world for a long time. Like certainly in my, I visited a number of forest schools and outdoor nurseries, and there's definitely this really exciting outdoor education movement, and kind of forest school classes being offered to children in urban and rural areas, which is fantastic. But in my interviews with people, I definitely got the sense, you know, that children are encouraged to see kind of the outdoors as dirty, and other species as, you know, vermin, as they get older. And just the enclosure of children in the classroom, you know, for 12,000 hours of their school life, whatever, is kind of enough to create the kind of society that we live in. And, you know, the evidence suggests that nature play and play outdoors, forest school, has really, really positive benefits for kids. So increasing confidence, and then all the mental and physical benefits, such as kind of reducing stress and balancing the nervous system, and other ones I write about in Losing Eden. So I think that this is kind of a deep dysfunction in our culture, but certainly the lockdown, and, you know, who knows how long that's going to go on for. You know, yeah, I worry how that will affect kids. mean, there's a lot of digital stuff going on, which is super. There's, you know, lots of documentaries, and there's lots of great, you know, people like Wildlife Trusts and so on putting webcams up and that kind of thing. But you know, that's not, it's not as good, is it?
Well, it's not as good, but there's definitely there's been some very strong voices reminding us how important it is to get outside, which is I've been kind of pleasantly surprised by. You know, it seems like there's a great awareness of the mental health benefits of. I mean, again, it's crazy that it even needs saying, because it should be so obvious. But I'm glad we are being reminded of this. And I don't know if you've noticed the same, but on our one exercise a day, you know, these kind of times we're allowed to go outside, I've been struck by just how beautiful I found everything. And it's partly because it's spring and everything is coming up, but I can't remember in this country being so struck by everyday beauty of the streets around where I live, and seeing things as if for the first time. I don't know if you've noticed something similar.
Yeah, it's not this week, the week before, I ended up like not leaving the house for 4 days because I've got like a balcony and I wasn't feeling very well. It wasn't COVID, but I didn't know at that time. So then on the day I went out, I walked in the woods next to the house, and it was phenomenal. Like the impact on my mood, the impact, like the light was coming through the trees, as you say, all the buds were opening. It was just ludicrously pleasant. And I think what I've noticed, and it's often on social media, like I follow a few nature writers obviously on social media, but I don't have like nature Twitter as my default. I have kind of sarcastic London media Twitter as my default. And the propensity, the change in people tweeting about birdsong, tweeting about birds, like putting up funny gifs of dogs staring at stuff saying me when I see a bird now, like it's amazing. Everyone wants gardening information, people want to grow things, and part of that is a bit of a blitz spirit, kind of grow your own, which isn't maybe the best reaction to this, but it is fascinating that people's reaction to being indoors so much isn't just I want to go to the pub, it's I want to be outdoors and I want to surround myself in nature. I miss nature.
Yeah,
I wonder if part of that is the kind of multi-sensory aspects of, oh God, sorry. How do you turn FaceTime off? Sorry, guys. The kind of multi-sensory aspects of the natural world. So, yeah, my experience has been really similar to the one that you just described. And I'm finding like being able to smell a bit of lavender or some water mint or just anything that I can kind of smell. And then the birdsong obviously seems louder. I've been taking wild garlic for funny. But yeah, the multi-sensory aspect, I think, you know, one of the ideas that I write about in Losing Eden is biophilia, which was kind of developed by E.O. Wilson. And he says in his book of the same name, you know, it's such an obvious point, but living things and life itself is more interesting than things that aren't alive. But I think that's something that I definitely often forget and take for granted and don't see. You know, just ignore the kind of butterflies or the colours or the shapes around me, when actually, you know, at the moment when restoration is constrained and all the other things that I normally would have to distract myself are limited, just tuning into those simple things of colour and sound and smell are just very life enhancing and healing.
So there's two things going on at the moment. There is this, I'm sure, kind of fear being instilled in young minds about the outside world being dangerous and a place of contamination, but people seem to be experiencing this very visceral reconnection and yearning really for you know, the outside world that we're being told we can't go into more than once a day for an essential reason. it seems to have touched off something very deep in a lot of people of like, we need more, we need as much as we can get. So we'll see where that goes. When we are allowed out again, what are your plans with the books? Because I know this conversation at Stanford was part of, you were going to do other events, I think. There was going to be, and were those events going to be outside? It strikes me that that's really where they should happen, in the woods or under trees or somewhere where people can see and touch the things you're talking about. What are your plans for these events, kind of when we're allowed to have them again?
Well, Lucy and I were having a chat the other day, and we were like, maybe by the time the paperbacks come out, we can have another bite at the cherry, you know. And all of the ones that were planned are very much indoors, because I guess England and weather. But I really like the idea of doing something outside. Like, that would be lovely. And I don't know, it's a really funny time, as you know, to like say to people who's, you know, in a whole world of uncertainty, buy this book about plants. But the thing that has been actually very lovely is I've received quite a lot of messages from readers being like, this has been essentially, at its heart, Rootbound is a book about finding stability in plants when everything else makes no sense at all. And it's been nice to see people connecting with that, or offering some level of comfort at this very bizarre time. But as for plans, I don't know. I'd just like to go outside a bit more in general, really. Yeah.
Well, we all will eventually.
Eventually, yeah.
Okay, well, maybe that's a good place to leave it, with the thought of going outside at some happy future time. But thank you both so much for these books that you've written. They are beautiful, they're fascinating, they're deep, they're full of wonder and full of the science of awe, and they have made my brain bigger through reading them. So anyone watching this, I'll hold them up again so you can see Rootbound and Losing Eden. And obviously bookshops are closed, but please buy these books, people who are watching this. We were originally going to do this event at Stanford's bookshop, so it would be lovely if you visited the Stanford's website. I think you can order through there, but get hold of a copy. And thank you, Lucy, thank you, Alice, and I hope we meet again physically at some point in the future.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you, Alice.